And here's the thing. Are we instinctively, do you think, more left-wing or right-wing? 0344 499 1000. So there's a few points. I'm genuinely not absolutely sure where this one's going, okay? So just bear with me as I slightly think aloud on events, because it's interesting just how things divide up and where we go with the current news and the unsettled or unfinished business across the pond. So Trump lost, Biden won, okay? We all get that. But I'm not sure the Republicans as a party lost. They've done better than the Democrats. The race for congressional supremacy is just as important. The Republicans have done better than the Democrats. The Republicans simply had a better election. In essence, Biden outdid his own party and the Republican Party outdid Trump. The Democrats haven't controlled the Senate for something like 6 years, and that's not about to change. Nonetheless, okay, Biden's got the big gig, and his vice president-elect, Kamala Harris, becomes the highest-ranking woman in American history. But there was no landslide, and 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. 70 million people. You heard in that clip Biden talking about the most of any presidential candidate, etc. And second to that is Donald Trump, the most of any Republican candidate, the highest in history, higher numbers than most Democrats. Obama and Clinton could only have dreamt of those kind of numbers. And that's sort of what intrigues me about this whole story. Are we instinctively more left-wing or more right-wing? 0344 499 1000. I'm hearing people absolutely lose their sugar over this election in the States. You've got the die-hard Trump fanatics who believe that there's been some kind of North Korean election fraud. But on the other side, you've got this kind of curious contingent of Biden supporters who not only define Joe as some kind of messiah, but they really do think that Donald Trump was Mao Zedong. People crying in the streets because the bad guy has lost. Folks saying they feel safer now that the tyrant won't be around any longer. I mean, did you see that fella on CNN bawling his eyes out? This wasn't somebody they were interviewing, by the way. This was one of their own, one of their main political commentators. He's a guy called Van Jones. I mean, you have a listen to this. This is unreal, okay? This is a professional political commentator on national/international TV responding to Trump losing.
Well, it's easier to be a parent this morning. It's easier to be a dad. It's easier to tell your kids character matters. It matters. Telling the truth matters. Being a good person matters. And it's easier for a whole lot of people.
Oh, go and change your diaper, man. What's wrong with you? Flippin' Nora. It's Donald Trump. Do you remember, by the way, back in the 60s? Well, I say you remember. You might be students of history may well be aware. Walter Cronkite was the guy that announced JFK had been assassinated back in the 60s. And it's an incredible piece of footage. And he tries to hold it together because it is such a moment in history. And he was clearly aware of that. And a much liked president had been shot dead. And Walter Cronkite kind of breaks, his voice breaks just as he's making this announcement. And he always kind of slightly kicked himself for that. He felt he sort of lost journalistic control because his voice broke a little. Nobody would have judged Walter Cronkite, one of the best and greatest, slickest newscasters, as they were called, of his time. But he always felt that he sort of let something down by doing that, but he didn't. But Van Jones here, oh boy, he did, didn't he? Eh? This is the man you're meant to turn to because you trust everything about his solid Van with his political analysis. He knows what he's doing. He's confident. He's ribald. He's got it all lined up. And he just bawled his eyes out on the telly. So there's people like him. It's called a sort of Trump derangement syndrome, it's called. But 70 million people voted for Trump. Van, did you not see that? You're a political commentator, man. They're not all mad, vile racists. And I've often found that if you want crystal clear and objective thinking on these matters, always defer to Parris. I'm not talking about the capital of France. I'm talking about Matthew Parris, the left-leaning Tory who now writes brilliantly for the Times. He's going to be on with us in just a bit. But at the weekend, he wrote this, and I think he absolutely nailed it here. He says, Trump undoubtedly dog-whistled to racists and bigots, but he spoke for many who were not racists and bigots. When he publicly insulted the government of China, He dog-whistled to jingoists and xenophobes, but he spoke for many who are neither. When he spoke for the left behind blue-collar America, he dog-whistled to many rabble-rousing rednecks, but he spoke for many more thoughtful Americans too. When he abused Angela Merkel in personal terms, he dog-whistled to many foolish isolationists, but he spoke for many who were rightly resentful of EU protectionism. And all this it's absolutely spot on. How do we want our politicians? I've done phone-ins on this for years. When you ask that question, who in an ideal world do you want as our Prime Minister? People will, and I've always done, people used to call in and say, what about, we need someone like Alan Sugar, the CEO of Tesco, or the new boss of John Lewis. Essentially, people who aren't professional politicians, who know how to run things. Well, America did just that. And it wouldn't be wrong to say that it kind of worked. 70 million votes. Not quite enough. It's interesting, though. I stumbled on this clip of Donald Trump. Now, have a listen to this. This is Donald Trump on Oprah Winfrey in 88, wasn't it? So 32 years ago. Now, his voice is almost, it's only just recognisable, but just have a listen to how credible and sharp, and it's a great clip. I love this. It's Donald Trump talking to Oprah 32 years ago. Here he is.
Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And, hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
That is impressive, right? In anybody's book, that is impressive. Trump 32 years ago. And I can see exactly why that kind of talk got him to the White House. Sadly, by the time he got there, of course, he'd lost the shine, that fluency, that sense of speaking the truth. He decided he needed to amp things up. So he kind of just started lying because he knew that his diehard fan base would never call him out, and the waverers and the fence-sitters would sort of join in. He decided to placate fantasists, as it were. But he got 70 million votes. Are we instinctively left-wing or right-wing? 0344 499 1000. On the other side, Biden didn't get a landslide because the harder left blew it for him. He was messing around with groups that wanted to defund the police. He never called it out. Black Lives Matter arguably lost him that landslide. I mean, he edged it, but it lost him the landslide. Over here, Boris Johnson did a similar thing. Remember all the talk of going into Brexit, stopping freedom of movement? We all know there will be a spectacular reversal of that because they've set out so many exceptions and exemptions that it kind of ceases to mean anything. And in any case, putting Brexit aside, if Johnson was serious about immigration and curtailing immigration, if that's your thing, where is the rhetoric on the non-EU immigration side of things? Not a word, because he's got no intention of doing anything about it. Boris Johnson himself isn't going to control EU immigration. Our vote to leave the EU will do that. Priti Patel does the same thing over migrants crossing the channel. These people are royally taking the mick out of you. I promise you. I never thought this 6-7 months ago. 0344 499 1000. I was trying to think which leaders we've had over here who've managed to genuinely appeal to the popular voter, as well as sticking philosophically, if you like, to their core political aims. The two most successful, this is interesting, leaders we've had are Thatcher and Blair. Blair gave it a go with some huge success, in fact, of course. It went a bit wrong when he started killing innocent Iraqis. That was his nod to populism, I suppose. But the person who really got it right was Thatcher. And again, I go back to Matthew Parris. He said she could walk successfully the tightrope between intelligent right-wing thinking and populism. She had a super keen ear for the discontents of what snootier people would have called the ordinary people, but combined it with an equally keen brain for policy and a deep distrust of mob rule, he said. And he's right. 0344 499 1000. So where does this leave us? We've got Biden. Biden is not Jeremy Corbyn, okay? Let's get that out there. In all probability, if Biden was a British politician, he would probably be in the Conservative Party. I don't know where he'd sit, which bench, who his cohorts might be in the Tory Party. He'd be a left-leaning Tory, what some would have called a wet, but he'd certainly be in the Tory Party. He might cross the floor to a Starmer-based Labour Party. But he's not Corbyn, that's my point. He's not Corbyn. But he is the president-elect of the United States. I know Mike Graham was saying we're resisting that, because if anybody is stupid enough to think, by the way, that any investigation into this election is likely to change the result of this election, because there's a couple of images of a few trailer park merchants burning some ballots and a couple of characters who are hiding or not allowing somebody into a poll, none of that's going to change anything. This election was run on the same basis as any other election has been run in the United States. Go back 2016, go back 2012, go back 2008, go back 2004, any year you like, and you will find election fraud of those kind of little pockets, those little YouTube stories of people monkeying around. It's not big, not clever, not legal. I get all of that. Joe Biden is the next president of the United States. We've got to work with that. But what does it mean in terms of our politics? Because Trumpism, if you like, cannot be dead with 70 million people voting for Trump. I mean, there's a possibility he comes back in 4 years' time, probably not as a Republican, but he might come back. So there is a love for Trump. There is still a love for Boris Johnson, despite the seismic blunders that he's put his size 9s into over the last few months, despite all that's going on with coronavirus. So Trump, 230,000 Americans dead, whatever it is, man alive. He still won in at 70 million people. So Biden didn't get the landslide, but he still won. But boy, Trump and the Republican Party did better than the Democrats. They could still be controlling things over there. So let's not lose sight of that. I think people are probably instinctively centre-right. I've always thought that. I think if you look at the point that Matthew Parris was making, Thatcher probably made the better job of appealing to all those elements without looking like a nutter. Trump ended up looking like a nutter, but he still got 70 million votes. We can't discount that. So are we instinctively more left-wing or right-wing? Americans, Brits, Europeans, Westerners, if you like, more left-wing or right-wing? 0344 499 1000. In a moment, we'll chat to Matthew Parris, Times columnist, former Tory MP. Sir John Curtice, firstly, Professor of Politics, University of Strathclyde. It's interesting, John, isn't it, that this does divide up. It looks like the Brexit result to me.
Yes, and it's because it looks like the Brexit result that, in my view, you shouldn't use the terms left and right. There are really two major divisions that tend to exist in democratic societies. One indeed is about left and right, and it's essentially about whether or not we think society should be more or less equal, and in particular about how we organise the labour market, how much should incomes differ between people, how much should the government regulate things, and where usually people who are less well off or working class tend to be more left-wing than those who are better off or are middle class. And that, was the staple of British politics for much of the post-war era. But actually, Brexit didn't divide. On British social attitudes, we ask questions about, do you think the government should redistribute income from the better off, the less well off? Do you think that, ordinary people don't get their fair share of the nation's wealth? And you ask those kinds of questions, and then you ask people their views about Brexit, and you discover there's no relationship at all. People on the left, on the questions of economic inequality, were just as likely to vote leave as were those on the right. What underlay Brexit and underlies much of the so-called cultural divide in the United States is an argument essentially between what we might want to call social conservatives and social liberals. And it's an argument about whether or not at the end of the day you prefer to live in a society where most people adhere to the same social mores, we adhere to the same symbols, we're pretty homogenous culturally as a society, or whether you prefer to live in a society that is diverse, racially, linguistically, religiously, etc., and where you accept that basically the rules that people follow to run their everyday lives, including some pretty crucial issues like questions about abortion and sexual mores, etc., that this is essentially for individuals to decide. And that was the division that underlay Brexit, and it's, again, crucial to understanding the division between Trump and Biden, between Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. It's Black Lives Matter, it's abortion, it's where do people stand on the religious spectrum? It's the biggest division in the U.S. But whether or not you are socially conservative or socially liberal is not necessarily anything at all to do with your views about economic inequality, which is, of course, one of the reasons why somebody like Donald Trump could attract voters with relatively, non-college educated whites, as they would say in the U.S., including from the Rust Belt states, normally traditional Democratic territory, but Trump could win them. And in exactly the same way here, go back to the last general election. I mean, working class voters were just as likely as middle class voters to vote conservative, and that's one of the reasons why that so-called Labour red wall.
Indeed. And of course, Thatcher also a huge beneficiary of precisely that phenomenon. I mean, let's bring in Matthew Parris here. Matthew, afternoon to you. Thanks for being with us. I mean, you wrote in the Times, I thought it was a great piece within your column about Trump's dog whistle politics. It's very easy, isn't it, to sort of just write that off and say this is appealing to racists and bigots. But actually, there were a lot of middle Americans who, in fact, he did speak for. And 70 million people can't all be mad, bad, vile racists and xenophobes.
Yes, I do think that, and I agree with every word that John Curtice has just said. But I would add this: I do think there was an economic dimension to it. I do think that those 70 million disproportionately come from the part of the United States, or the part of the United States culture and economy that have not prospered financially, not prospered economically from the advance of the American economy. So when they talk about them as being left behind, it isn't only left behind in social attitudes, but also economically left behind. And now you might reply, well, what was a rich man like Trump ever going to do for them anyway? And the answer is probably there was nothing he could or would have done. Nevertheless, I think the idea of the feeling of being left behind economically inculcates in people a kind of two fingers salute, up yours, to what they take as the political establishment. And they're going to vote for anybody who encourages them in the view that the political elite has left them behind, even if he hasn't actually got any practical plans to help them.
Yeah. Does that work, do you think, also on the left? I think of the amount of debates I've done with people who, have lived on estates, for example, working class people, lived on estates that have never really had the lick of paint they've needed. They've never been brought up to scratch in terms of all the promises politicians have made, but have continually year on year voted in local authority, Labour local authorities to sort it out because their perception was they're the guys that are going to make things better for them. Is it the same thinking?
Yes, it is the same thinking. And in the end, such people end up just despising politics and politicians generally. And Trump's genius was to appear to the electorate as though he wasn't a politician at all. And he certainly didn't use political language. So he managed to stand outside the general condemnation of politics and politicians.
Yeah, and John Curtice, what do we make of 70 million people, though? I mean, these can't be ignored in the same way that, we had to go back to the aforementioned Brexit. I mean, it's, if things are 50-50, what does a country do with that? What do we do with that rather divisive statistic?
That's an important question, Ian, because although Brexit's disappeared off our political radar at the moment, I think certainly underlying amongst the electorate, that division is still very, very much there. And I think, just to build on what Matthew was saying, which he's entirely right, it's, it's a mixture of economy and culture. And another way of looking at it is that in part this is a division, is partly, yes, a rebellion against a political elite. It is arguably also a rebellion against big business, because part of what's going on here is a rebellion against what some people feel are the adverse consequences of the process of globalization. One of the consequences of globalization is indeed greater migration, and that then begins to create concerns in some people's minds about the cultural consequences of migration, and of course its economic implications. But it's also a product of the fact that, living standards for many people in many advanced societies have not been advancing very much recently. They remember the financial crash of 2008 to 2009, which was also arguably the product of financial globalization. And in a sense, Brexit in part was about, and again the vote for Trump is about, looking for protection against the winds of globalized capitalism. And these are folk who, yes, are socially conservative and want, concerned about abortion and immigration, etc. But they also want big business to be put under control as well.
Indeed. John, always good to talk. Thank you. Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at University of Strathclyde. He is, of course, that election voice you see on the telly every time one comes around, and a knighthood for his troubles too. Are we more left? Are we more right? Are we down the middle? What are we? Centre-right? Come on, let's call it for what it is. This is a centre-right country, yes? Would that sound reasonable? 0344 499 1000. We'll go to your calls shortly. We'll talk Wales. We'll talk also about that vaccination which suddenly appeared over the weekend. Where did that come from, by the way?